Hey everyone, let's talk about graphic narratives. In this lecture, we're going to look at the lasting legacy of underground comics, the way it fundamentally shifted and altered the way people thought about comics and the kinds of people who made them. Before we get into the meat of the lecture, I want to talk about two important trends that were happening in the comic world: pop art and détournement. Pop art had been a very big fine art movement that had significantly shifted the ideas about what could be fine art. Roy Lichtenstein, as you see here, took comic panels and blew them up and made them into fine art paintings by selecting certain panels out of the context of the comics page. Roy Lichtenstein essentially eliminates the meaning of the actual story and makes us focus on the way the comic communicates. Like Saul Steinberg in The New Yorker, his chief interest is for us to become very self-conscious about the way comics communicate and the kinds of mechanisms they have: speech bubbles, Ben-Day dots, graphic elements. And so pop art is a movement that tended to eliminate meaning in comics. And the commentary it provided was largely that culture that we have or identify is largely meaningless. Détournement, on the other hand, attempted to re-radicalize comics by removing the mundane and everyday kinds of language that comics had and insert into them more radical kinds of ideas, taking ordinary things in pop culture that people were familiar with, cowboy movies in this case, from the return of the Durruti column, and inserting into it a kind of satirical and ironic commentary that underscored the possibility of social change and used the spectacle of comics against the very mechanism that it up till now had supported, which was capitalism. So these are two different kinds of art impulses that were going forward in the way people thought about comics. And the underground comics is really chiefly responded to the idea of détournement, even though the word itself, the French concept by the situationists, was largely forgotten fairly early on. Gilbert Sheldon was one of the popular mainstream of the underground press, where he got his fabulous furry freak brothers into many different publications. These three characters were always on the lookout for drugs and sex and food, and that was sort of the simple impulses of their recreation that absorbed them. It wasn't a really deep social commentary, but it was a lot of fun, and the characters were sort of vividly imagined. Like a lot of underground comics, the characters were often put into contexts and other social situations that reflected on the difference between hippie culture and mainstream culture. In this comic book cover, we can see it is clearly a play on the very famous Manet painting, Luncheon, where we see a pair of students enjoying a bit of banquet out in the countryside. Again, the way hippie culture appropriated other cultures and shifted its meaning to its own purposes was clearly similar to the idea of détournement. Much of what we know and see in the 1960s hippie psychedelic colors and character was not unique to itself, but was in fact kind of borrowings from earlier work, such as Aubrey Beardsley from the 1890s, proved very popular. So a lot of what we see in the psychedelic culture was, in fact, a kind of reinsertion of new meaning and new content and ideas onto older forms. Comics such as Little Orphan Annie, now Little Orphan Amphetamine, again, taking something that people would have one idea about and shifting it into another. This can also be seen in Bobby London's Dirty Duck. He was very fond of Crazy Cat, and he used his own creation, Dirty Duck, to explore the ideas of Crazy Cat by George Herman. Also, it was important to undermine the mainstream, and Wally Wood created this poster of the Disney Memorial Orgy a year after the death of Walt Disney. This was originally published in a magazine and then reprinted as a poster that was sold in head shops. Disney Corporation at first ignored the poster, didn't want to give the publishers any free publicity, but as it proved popular year in and year out, they eventually tried to track down the publisher, but in these small fly-by-night organizations, they found it very difficult to trap them. So they eventually, believe it or not, created their own head shop and there lured in the publisher so they could serve them a cease and desist order. During this time, there was actually a comic strip that made it into the newspapers in San Francisco by Dan O'Neill called Odd Bodkins. That was really meant to embody this idea of counterculture and hippie ideology. Dan O'Neill worked from 1961 to 72 in the San Francisco Chronicle, but he was constantly getting into trouble with his newspaper editors because he had this penchant for copying Disney characters and repurposing them in his strip. Eventually, he was laid off from San Francisco Chronicle, and he took his impulse to get it back at Disney by creating and encouraging a bunch of artist friends to join him on an operation to liberate Mickey Mouse. And the Air Pirates funnies was clearly borrowed from Walt Disney comics, and it was repurposing them in a kind of determined manner. You can see here Mickey Mouse is clearly derived from this Big Little book of the Mail Pilot from the 1940s, and instead of carrying mail, Mickey is now hauling dope. The Air Pirates were determined to make trouble for Disney, and they actually had their comics secreted into the Disney corporate boardroom as a kind of thumbing your nose at the big man. Well, they went after them tooth and nail, and they fought this legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court, where they lost spectacularly. Eventually, faced with tens of thousands of dollars in fines and refusals to pay the fees owed to Disney, they began going to comic conventions and they're selling their Disney mock-ups to the adoring crowds as a way to make money to pay off Disney. Disney finally, disgusted with all of this trouble that they were causing and bad publicity, they decided in the end to just let them go. In underground comics, there was a lot of really salacious and seedy material. It seemed the idea of having unbridled liberty to make comics about everything and anything meant you could make the most disgusting, the most perverse, and the most violent comics imaginable. Checkered Demon by S. Clay Wilson seemed to be pushing in all those directions all at once. This comic was rather violent and horrific by underground standards, but it pointed to this idea of liberty and the sense of libertine, the way in which people could have that freedom of expression go into some very dark and disturbing areas. With this sense that comics could be about anything, there was a real concerted effort to shift the focus away from this up till now very male-dominated business and to really create comics that spoke to and exposed the terrible oppression of women in the United States. Trina Robbins, a longtime supporter of feminist comics, came out and edited It Ain't Me, Babe in 1970. They created a number of comics, a forum for different comic artists to work together. And in these comic pages, they explored both ways of subverting and reimagining these comic classics in the male-dominated world, but also ways of exploring personal narratives. This became a very important area of innovation in women's comics, to write about their own stories in positive ways. Another very important early comic that explored the idea of personal narratives was Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary in 1972. Justin Green had been inspired to create comics by Robert Crumb when he felt he really needed to deal with his own Christian upbringing and his psychologically sordid past. Justin Green worked on Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary for a number of years, supported in part by Dennis Kitchen in his Kitchen Sink Press, who had a number of different artists in his employ, keeping them focused on making comics. It was a difficult business to be in. There weren't many options for publication, and there wasn't much of an audience for innovative and different kinds of narrative. Harvey Pecker was a friend of Robert Crumb, and he also got the comic bug. He began writing comics, mostly just about what it means to be an ordinary guy living in Cleveland and working at the Veterans Administration as a file clerk. He went about just talking about his everyday conversations and situations. Harvey Pecker became a very important advocate for the idea of comics about everyday life and comics about ordinary people and ordinary situations. Robert Crumb lent his own artistry to one of the early issues of American Splendor, but it was actually a number of different artists who would eventually team up with Harvey Pecker. He would write the strips, and then he would work in a number of different styles. And that was what made American Splendor so interesting, was that even though the voice of the characters was consistent, their appearances shifted and changed according to who was the artist rendering them. Women's comics continued to thrive and grow through the 70s and 80s. Roberta Gregory, who worked on a long-running strip known as Bitchy Bitch, about this nasty woman who's had a rough childhood and is always looking for ways to take advantage of situations, but is really desperately lonely and is terribly unfit for a mature relationship. She struggles and is horribly vindictive and self-destructive, but we really feel for Bitchy Bitch because we deep down realize she's just trying to make do in these extremely difficult situations for women. Linda Berry also got her start in the second generation, inspired by Robert Crumb, that comics could be about anything. Her early work deals with relationships and family matters and strange observations about the material world and everyday life. She settles in mid-career doing a series called Ernie Puch's Comique, which is going to be about a number of children who grew up in a neighborhood very similar to the one she grew up in Portland, Oregon. In these comics, she finds these characters constantly contending with the arbitrary justice meted out by adults and their own fraught relationships growing up, wholly confused about what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do things. It's a really powerful and beautiful observations about life in the 60s and the ways in which girls found opportunities to band together. Most of Lynda Barry's comics are only slightly autobiographical. She riffs on memories and ideas that she experienced. But in 2002, she came up with a comic called 100 Demons, where she dove more directly into her past and stories and did a series of strips detailing difficult times in her life and moments of clarity that she realized that as an adult, things were never going to be as bad as they were back then. Lynda Barry's comics began to explore more elements of collage, the idea of memories, the kind of putting things together. Obviously, handmade things becomes a very important feature. And she even talks about the process of making the comic in the comic, that she took up a Japanese brush, and the title 100 Demons is based on a Zen idea for a composition where a Zen student will draw 100 demons as a way of trying to exorcise them from their consciousness. More recently, Lynda Barry has been involved in creating comics about making comics and creative writing, and really delving into her personal struggles about being a comic artist and a writer and trying to find an authentic process. Through this, her work demonstrates an extraordinary knowledge of how creativity works and really delves deeply into what it means to be a creative person. The underground comic movement had always been a do-it-yourself kind of movement, hearkening back to the days when Robert Crumb pushed a baby pram full of his comics up and down Haight-Ashbury, selling them for 35 cents to the hippies on the street. That impulse has come full circle with Lynda Barry. She's found a way to bring that idea that anyone can make comics and anyone can find something important to say with comics.